take a slow breath and settle in. Tonight, we slip quietly into the Pacific, into the true story of the USS Indianapolis, a journey through darkness, warm water, and the quiet patience of the open sea. No dramatics, no noise, just the steady unraveling of a night that changed hundreds of lives. Let your body rest as the ocean carries you gently into the story. The night around the USS Indianapolis felt impossibly still, as if the Pacific itself had fallen asleep. Warm water stretched in every direction, smooth as polished glass, reflecting a sky so black it erased the horizon line. Most of the crew drifted in and out of half dreams, tucked into narrow bunks or stretched on quiet decks, lulled by the soft hum of engines and the gentle sway of a ship that had crossed more ocean than most of them would ever see again. Frank O'Donnell lay awake, with his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling of the enlisted quarters. The air was warm, heavy, and smelled faintly of machine oil and sea salt. Somewhere above him, a few sailors murmured about the heat, about home, about how peaceful the night felt. Someone laughed quietly. Someone else asked for a match. Ordinary sounds, ordinary concerns. No one had any reason to expect the night to change. The Indianapolis cut through the Pacific with a steady confidence. An old ship, seasoned and scarred, but reliable. There was something comforting about its weight, the way it settled into each swell like an animal too large to be bothered. The ocean had accepted it for years. Tonight seemed no different. Frank closed his eyes for a moment, letting the familiar vibration of the engines roll through his chest. He thought about the cargo they had delivered, classified, important, something he wasn't allowed to understand. And now they were heading toward Leyte, out in open water without escort, a vulnerability he tried not to dwell on. He heard a sailor above him shift in his hammock, muttering, "Feels like a quiet night." Someone else replied, "Quiet's good. Quiet means sleep." Frank didn't correct him. He wasn't afraid of noise. Noise told you where danger was. Noise gave you warning. Silent nights were the ones that turned without mercy. The first explosion didn't sound like an explosion at all. It was more like a deep metallic shudder, a violent exhale from the ship's belly that made the steel beneath them tremble, like it had been struck by something enormous and invisible. Frank shot upright, heart thudding. A faint groan travelled through the hull. Then the lights flickered, once, twice, then snapped into darkness. For a moment, no one moved. It was too sudden, too strange. Men froze mid-breath, trying to understand what their bodies already knew. Then came the second explosion. This one was unmistakable. A violent, ripping blast shook the ship from stern to bow, followed by the roar of air being forced where it shouldn't go. Shouts erupted through the darkness. The floor lurched sideways, throwing men out of bunks and onto the metal deck. Someone shouted, "We've been hit!" Another voice yelled for flashlights. Someone prayed. Someone cursed. Frank pushed to his feet, gripping the edge of a locker as the ship heaved again. The air was suddenly hotter, filled with dust and the metallic tang of ruptured steel. From deep below, he heard something worse. The rush of water pouring into compartments that were never meant to touch the sea. The Indianapolis had been wounded, and the ocean knew it. A low, groaning sound reverberated through the ship, as if it were protesting its own collapse. Men stumbled through the dark, reaching for boots, life vests, anything. The floor tilted harder. Frank's breath stuttered as he realized how fast she was listing. "Everyone up!" a voice shouted through the shadows. "Move! Move!" Frank followed the familiar path toward the ladder well, feeling his way along warm metal walls, stepping over fallen sailors trying to find their balance. The tilt worsened. The ship wasn't just sinking. It was surrendering, giving in to the weight of the Pacific with terrifying speed. A faint glow flickered from a shattered light fixture as Frank reached the main deck. And in that dim, trembling illumination, he saw what he had feared. The Indianapolis was bleeding fire and smoke into the night, her hull ripped open, water boiling into places it never should have reached. The ocean around them, impossibly calm minutes ago, now waited with patient, dark hunger. The quiet night was over, and the Indianapolis was dying. Chaos swept the decks before anyone fully understood what had happened. One moment, the Indianapolis was gliding through a peaceful black stretch of Pacific water. The next, the ship trembled violently, metal groaning as if something enormous had struck it from within. Men stumbled out of bunks into smoke-thick air, the entire ship slanting beneath their feet. Flashlights flickered on and off. Shouts echoed through the dark. "Torpedoes! Fire below! Engine rooms flooding!" No single voice rose above the rest. Just a collision of fear, confusion, and the instincts of men who'd trained for danger, but never for this. Frank braced himself against the wall, one hand over his mouth to block the smoke rolling through the passageways. The second explosion had been unmistakable. Water was forcing its way into lower compartments fast. He could feel the ship dipping forward, bow first, every few seconds. The list grew steeper. Men were thrown sideways as they ran, clattering down stairwells, boots skidding over steel warmed by spreading fire. On deck, the night looked insultingly calm. The sky was starless but smooth, the ocean glassy. Frank reached the starboard rail, just as another small burst of fire flared midship, illuminating panicked sailors racing across the slanted deck. Some wore life vests, some carried nothing but what they'd been sleeping in. A few men stood frozen, staring at the water, as if waiting for orders that wouldn't come. The tilt increased. The bow sank visibly now, the ship groaning under its own collapsing weight. "She's going down!" someone shouted, voice cracking. Smoke curled upward, drifting into the windless night. Then the order came, clear, sharp, and final. Abandon ship! Frank didn't hesitate. He climbed the rail alongside several others. The drop to the water looked longer than it should have been, the slanted deck making the height deceptive. Men jumped one after another, some steady, some panicking, some stumbling in the dark and sliding off the deck unprepared. Frank jumped. Cold water wrapped around him instantly, warmer than expected on the surface, but still a shock after the heat and smoke. He kicked hard and broke into the air, coughing out a mouthful of seawater. All around him were silhouettes of sailors, some yelling, some silent, some already clinging to floating debris. He turned in the water toward the ship and felt his breath stop. The Indianapolis was dying fast. The bow was nearly submerged. Fire glimmered along torn metal, hissing as water swallowed it. Smoke poured upward like a dark pillar. Men still clung to the deck, sliding into the sea as the angle grew sharper. Frank began swimming sideways to avoid the suction he knew was coming. The stern rose, lifted unnaturally high, towering like a black cliff against the dark sky. For a moment it hung there, tilted, creaking, water rushing beneath it. Someone near Frank whispered, "Oh God, oh God." Then the stern came down. It slipped beneath the surface with terrifying speed, dragging air and debris into the vortex. A rolling wave slammed into Frank, flipping him beneath the water. He fought upward, lungs burning, and broke the surface again amid foam and fragments of the ship. Silence followed. Not true silence, but the strange padded quiet of open sea swallowing a steel giant. Only the sounds of men breathing, coughing, crying out. The ocean around them was empty. No lifeboats, no flares, no radio distress signal had gone out. They all knew it. They had been travelling under heavy secrecy. No escort, no nearby ships. The nearest friendly vessel was hundreds of miles away. Frank treaded water, gripping a small piece of floating debris. Men clustered around anything that would hold weight. A crate, a bit of wood, a piece of bulkhead. Some swam toward faint voices. Some lay on their backs, exhausted, letting the water keep them afloat. The stars refused to come out. The darkness above them was the same darkness below. Frank scanned the horizon. Nothing. Only black water, stretching further than any man could swim. Someone shouted, "Where are the life rafts?" Another voice answered, hopeless. "Gone, blown off, sunk." Frank's heartbeat slowed to a cold, heavy rhythm. The ocean rocked them gently, almost soothing, almost mocking. Tiny splashes echoed all around, some human, some not. The Indianapolis was gone. And so were the chances of anyone knowing they'd vanished. Frank pulled the debris closer to him, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Men huddled in small floating groups, calling out names, calling out prayers. In the darkness, the realization settled like a weight. They were alone in the Pacific. Hundreds of men, no ship, no light, no plan. And help wouldn't come until someone noticed they hadn't arrived. Days from now. The night had only just begun. The afternoon sun turned vicious as it climbed higher, flattening the sky into a white glare that seemed to press directly into the survivors' skulls. Heat shimmered across the water, erasing the horizon and making the entire Pacific feel like one blinding sheet. Frank squinted, eyes burning from salt and exhaustion. Whatever strength the group had carried from the night was nearly gone. Reynolds leaned against the crate, barely able to lift his head. "Frank, feels like my skin's cooking." "I know," Frank said softly. "Keep low. Don't stare at the glare." Some men dipped their faces in the water for a moment's relief, but the warmth offered no comfort. Their bodies felt dry inside, tongues swelling, lips cracking. The slow torture of dehydration was settling in. Below them, the sharks had grown bolder. Long shadows drifted closer, the arcs tightening around the survivors. A fin cut the water only a few yards away before slipping under again, deliberate and calm. Men tried to keep their legs tucked, but cramps made it impossible for many. A sudden splash broke the uneasy quiet. A survivor farther away jerked upright, thrashing wildly. "Something grabbed me." "Stop splashing," someone yelled. But panic owned him. His movements were frantic, loud, exactly the kind that drew attention. Several fins shifted direction, slicing through the surface toward him. Frank looked away as the shouts cut off sharply. The ocean smoothed itself over within seconds, its surface unbroken, except for distant ripples. Reynolds gripped the crate. "Frank!" "Don't look," Frank whispered. "Just breathe." The torn life raft drifted a little closer, still barely afloat. The men clinging to it looked worse than those in the water. Sunken eyes, blistered skin, heads drooping from heat stroke. One lifted an arm in a faint wave before letting it drop again. Currents kept shifting, pulling the survivors into new shapes. Frank counted the men near him. Fewer than before. Too few. Faces he'd seen that morning were missing, claimed by exhaustion, confusion, or the shadows circling beneath them. Reynolds whispered, "Feels like we're disappearing." "We're still here," Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction. Heat thickened. The air tasted like metal. Some men began talking nonsense, muttering broken phrases or yelling at hallucinations. One insisted he saw a ship and started waving frantically until he realized he'd imagined it. Another called out for family members long gone. Some simply stared ahead with hollow eyes, suspended between consciousness and collapse. A faint rumble echoed through the water. Reynolds jerked up. "Frank, engines!" Frank listened. The group stirred, hope flickering across sunburned faces. But the sound faded into nothing, just another trick of heat and desperation. The disappointment settled like a weight. A few men quietly wept. Others went silent, their last reserves crumbling. The shark circled again. One passed so close, its fin brushed the surface with a whisper. Reynolds stiffened, but Frank steadied him with a hand. "They're watching for movement." Frank whispered. We stay still. Another survivor panicked a short distance away, kicking wildly as he imagined something below him. The motion was small, but out here, small was enough. 2 fins angled toward him. No, Frank called. Stop moving, stop. But the man was too far gone to hear. The splashing grew frantic, then cut off abruptly. The ocean folded over him in one smooth motion. Reynolds squeezed his eyes shut. I can't. Frank, I can't keep hearing that. Frank felt his own limits cracking, but he forced his voice steady. Look at me. Just today. We get through today. The sun burned overhead, the water warming into something thick and heavy. Men sagged against bits of debris, heads barely above the surface. A few drifted from their groups without realizing it, too disoriented to correct themselves. Frank scanned what was left of their circle. Faces peeling from sunburn, lips split open, minds fraying. The afternoon stretched on endlessly, the ocean growing sharper, more aware of every weakness. Reynolds whispered, Frank, how much more? Frank didn't know. He wasn't sure anyone could know. All he could say was, enough to still be here. The second afternoon was only beginning, and the ocean had already decided who was fading. Dawn rose slowly, as if unsure whether it wanted to expose what the night had scattered across the Pacific. A thin band of grey light stretched over the horizon, brushing the water with a pale shimmer. Frank blinked until his vision sharpened, and shapes that had been only whispers now formed into grim silhouettes. Men floating in every direction, spread far wider than he'd imagined in the dark. Small clusters clung to bits of wreckage. Others drifted alone, heads barely above water. What had felt like one large group during the night was now a broken field of survivors stretching across the swells. Reynolds, Frank murmured, checking beside him. You still with me? Reynolds lifted his head an inch. His lips were cracked white, eyes hollow. Yeah, he whispered. Still here. For now. The sun climbed with ruthless speed, turning the gentle warmth of night into harsh, punishing heat. Men shielded their eyes with trembling hands. Others dipped fabric into the water, squeezing it over their faces for a moment's relief. A sailor nearby croaked, I'd drink anything. God, anything. Don't, Frank said firmly. Salt water will kill you. The man nodded, though desperation lingered. As the light strengthened, the water cleared enough to reveal the shapes passing below. Long shadows, smooth arcs, and the slow, patient glide of something alive. A dorsal fin cut the surface 20 yards away before slipping under again. Reynolds stiffened. Frank, they're here. They've been here, Frank said, voice low. The sharks didn't rush or thrash. They moved with the confidence of creatures that understood the ocean belonged to them. Every so often a man splashed too loudly, and fins would angle in his direction before drifting away again, uninterested, for now. Currents pushed the survivors farther apart. Frank kicked just enough to guide himself and Reynolds toward a small group clinging to a wrecked crate. Arms brushed shoulders, bodies pressed close. The simple contact steadied nerves frayed thin. One man whispered, "Someone's got to see us. A plane. Something." Frank didn't reply. The truth was too bitter to say aloud. The sun rose higher, turning the water into a blinding mirror. Men closed their eyes against the glare. Thirst settled in like a weight, sharp, swelling their tongues, cracking their mouths. The salt on their skin stung every scrape. Hallucinations came quickly in heat like this. Frank heard a man behind him mumbling to someone who wasn't there. Another pointed at the horizon, insisting he saw a ship. A third swore he could hear church bells. Reynolds licked his lips and winced. "Feels like my whole mouth is drying up." "Try not to think about it," Frank murmured. "Save your strength." A body drifted nearby, face up, but still. Another survivor called to him softly, then louder, then gave up. The body spun slowly with the waves, drifting away. Beneath it, two dark shapes followed in steady circles. Reynolds turned his head. "I don't want to look at that." "Don't," Frank said. The torn life raft drifted about 50 yards off, sagging with the weight of the men clinging to it. Even from here, Frank could see their strained expressions. The raft floated, but only barely. It was more symbol than sanctuary. Another fin surfaced, closer this time, and paused before dipping below again. The survivors' circle drew tighter. Even the air felt tense, as if waiting for the next shift in the water. The heat thickened. Some men slipped beneath the surface for a second before jerking awake. Others drifted away from their groups, too disoriented to realize how far they'd gone. Reynolds swallowed hard. "Frank, what do we do now?" "We hold on," Frank said, jaw tight. "For how long?" Frank scanned the empty horizon. The morning felt endless already. Until something changes. Another fin glided past, smooth, deliberate. The day had barely begun, and the ocean, fully awake now, was cutting away the week. The afternoon sun turned vicious as it climbed higher, flattening the sky into a white glare that seemed to press directly into the survivors' skulls. Heat shimmered across the water, erasing the horizon and making the entire Pacific feel like one blinding sheet. Frank squinted, eyes burning from salt and exhaustion. Whatever strength the group had carried from the night was nearly gone. Reynolds leaned against the crate, barely able to lift his head. "Frank, feels like my skin's cooking." "I know," Frank said softly. "Keep low. Don't stare at the glare." Some men dipped their faces in the water for a moment's relief, but the warmth offered no comfort. Their bodies felt dry inside, tongues swelling, lips cracking. The slow torture of dehydration was settling in. Below them, the sharks had grown bolder. Long shadows drifted closer, the arcs tightening around the survivors. A fin cut the water only a few yards away before slipping under again, deliberate and calm. Men tried to keep their legs tucked, but cramps made it impossible for many. A sudden splash broke the uneasy quiet. A survivor farther away jerked upright, thrashing wildly. "Something grabbed me." "Stop splashing," someone yelled. But panic owned him. His movements were frantic, loud, exactly the kind that drew attention. Several fins shifted direction, slicing through the surface toward him. Frank looked away as the shouts cut off sharply. The ocean smoothed itself over within seconds, its surface unbroken, except for distant ripples. Reynolds gripped the crate. "Frank!" "Don't look," Frank whispered. "Just breathe." The torn life raft drifted a little closer, still barely afloat. The men clinging to it looked worse than those in the water. Sunken eyes, blistered skin, heads drooping from heat stroke. One lifted an arm in a faint wave before letting it drop again. Currents kept shifting, pulling the survivors into new shapes. Frank counted the men near him. Fewer than before. Too few. Faces he'd seen that morning were missing, claimed by exhaustion, confusion, or the shadows circling beneath them. Reynolds whispered, "Feels like we're disappearing." "We're still here," Frank said, though his voice lacked conviction. Heat thickened. The air tasted like metal. Some men began talking nonsense, muttering broken phrases or yelling at hallucinations. One insisted he saw a ship and started waving frantically until he realized he'd imagined it. Another called out for family members long gone. Some simply stared ahead with hollow eyes, suspended between consciousness and collapse. A faint rumble echoed through the water. Reynolds jerked up. "Frank, engines!" Frank listened. The group stirred, hope flickering across sunburned faces. But the sound faded into nothing, just another trick of heat and desperation. The disappointment settled like a weight. A few men quietly wept. Others went silent, their last reserves crumbling. The shark circled again. One passed so close, its fin brushed the surface with a whisper. Reynolds stiffened, but Frank steadied him with a hand. "They're watching for movement," Frank whispered. "We stay still." Another survivor panicked a short distance away, kicking wildly as he imagined something below him. The motion was small, but out here, small was enough. Two fins angled toward him. "No!" Frank called. "Stop moving! Stop!" But the man was too far gone to hear. The splashing grew frantic, then cut off abruptly. The ocean folded over him in one smooth motion. Reynolds squeezed his eyes shut. "I can't. Frank, I can't keep hearing that." Frank felt his own limits cracking, but he forced his voice steady. "Look at me. Just today. We get through today." The sun burned overhead, the water warming into something thick and heavy. Men sagged against bits of debris, heads barely above the surface. A few drifted from their groups without realizing it, too disoriented to correct themselves. Frank scanned what was left of their circle. Faces peeling from sunburn, lips split open, minds fraying. The afternoon stretched on endlessly, the ocean growing sharper, more aware of every weakness. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, how much more?" Frank didn't know. He wasn't sure anyone could know. All he could say was, "Enough to still be here." The second afternoon was only beginning, and the ocean had already decided who was fading. The sun finally dipped lower, melting into a red smear at the horizon. The heat eased, but the relief came with a price. Exhaustion sharpened, muscles stiffened, and the warm water that had felt oppressive all day now felt strangely cold. The survivors' bodies had been cooked, drained, and stretched thin. Now the chill crept into their bones. Frank took a slow breath. "Reynolds, stay awake." Reynolds stirred, but only barely. "Just resting my eyes." "No, if you fall asleep in the water, you slip under." Reynolds blinked hard, trying to focus. The shadows crowding the horizon darkened again, the light fading until the Pacific became one endless black surface. The oppressive glare of the day vanished, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt almost supernatural. Night settled like a heavy blanket. The sharks adjusted instantly. Where they had circled lazily during the day, they now moved with sharper intent, fins slicing the surface, shapes brushing too close to legs left hanging in the water. Every few minutes, a slick bump or nudge reminded the survivors how little separated them from the creatures below. Some men whispered prayers, some whispered nonsense, some whispered nothing at all. Frank's group tightened to keep their circle intact. A few survivors grabbed wrist to wrist, forming a loose human chain. The contact kept them from drifting apart in the darkness. A man to Frank's left murmured, "Feels like the whole ocean's listening." "It is," Frank said quietly. "Stay calm." The last glow of sunset faded completely, plunging them into full night. The clouds covered the stars again, sealing the sky. Darkness above, darkness below. No horizon. The sun finally dipped lower, melting into a red smear at the horizon. The heat eased, but the relief came with a price. Exhaustion sharpened, muscles stiffened, and the warm water that had felt oppressive all day now felt strangely cold. The survivors' bodies had been cooked, drained, and stretched thin. Now the chill crept into their bones. Frank took a slow breath. "Reynolds, stay awake." Reynolds stirred, but only barely. "Just resting my eyes." "No, if you fall asleep in the water, you slip under." Reynolds blinked hard, trying to focus. The shadows crowding the horizon darkened again, the light fading until the Pacific became one endless black surface. The oppressive glare of the day vanished, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt almost supernatural. Night settled like a heavy blanket. The sharks adjusted instantly. Where they had circled lazily during the day, they now moved with sharper intent, fins slicing the surface, shapes brushing too close to legs left hanging in the water. Every few minutes, a slick bump or nudge reminded the survivors how little separated them from the creatures below. Some men whispered prayers, some whispered nonsense, Some whispered nothing at all. Frank's group tightened to keep their circle intact. A few survivors grabbed wrist to wrist, forming a loose human chain. The contact kept them from drifting apart in the darkness. A man to Frank's left murmured, "Feels like the whole ocean's listening." "It is," Frank said quietly. "Stay calm." The last glow of sunset faded completely, plunging them into full night. The clouds covered the stars again, sealing the sky. Darkness above, darkness below. No horizon, no point of reference. Only faint splashes and the soft scrape of bodies bumping debris. Somewhere far off, a man screamed, a long, distant cry that broke into a choked gurgle. Then silence. Reynolds flinched. "Frank." "What was that?" "Don't think about it," Frank murmured. "Just stay close." The group drifted slightly, the current carrying them in slow arcs. A man near the edge slipped out of the circle by inches. Frank reached to pull him back, but the man jerked away, mumbling, "Get off! Get off me! I'm fine." He wasn't. Moments later, he drifted farther into the dark, his silhouette fading. No one saw what happened next. They only heard a splash, a short gasp, then nothing. Reynolds stared ahead, shaking. "Everything's going quiet." "That's how nights go out here," Frank said. "People stop talking. They stop fighting." He didn't mention what else he knew. That the sharks came closer when the splashing stopped. Stillness meant surrender. Surrender meant opportunity. Hours passed in slow, dreamlike stretches. Frank's limbs burned with fatigue. His mouth felt like sand. His vision blurred whenever he blinked too long. Yet he forced himself awake, listening to each sound, each shift, every faint motion in the water around them. Occasionally a survivor muttered through hallucinations, "There's a boat right there, right there. We just need to swim a little farther. Mum, Mum, I'm home." Frank held them steady if they came too close to drifting away. Sometimes he pulled them back. Sometimes he couldn't reach them in time. The ocean gave nothing back. At one point, something large brushed Frank's thigh. A slow, deliberate glide. He stiffened, holding Reynolds close, waiting. The sky began to lighten again, not with warmth or comfort, but with the dull grey of a world that had no intention of helping them. Dawn didn't rise so much as bleed slowly across the horizon, revealing the Pacific in pale, washed-out colours. Frank blinked hard, eyes burning as sunglare returned. Reynolds had drifted lower in the water overnight, his chin nearly touching the surface. Frank nudged him. Hey, Reynolds, don't fall asleep on me." Reynolds stirred, eyelids fluttering. "Feels like I didn't sleep at all." "You didn't," Frank murmured. "That's the point." The morning unveiled a brutal truth. There were fewer men than yesterday. Some faces Frank recognized were gone without a trace. A few groups were half the size they'd been the previous night. The raft still floated nearby, but the bodies clinging to it had changed. More slumped shoulders, more lifeless eyes, fewer voices. The sun climbed quickly again, the sky sharpening into a blinding blue. Heat arrived almost immediately, settling over them like a weight. Salt dried into their sunburned skin, cracking it further. Thirst became a constant ache. Voices rose around the group, more ragged than before. Water! Please! Just a drop. It can't be this hot. Frank forced his own breathing to stay slow, controlled. Panic wasted energy. Energy was life. Below him, the sharks had not left. Their shadows drifted with unsettling calm beneath the survivors, closer than ever. A fin passed within a few feet, brushing the surface with the slow ease of a creature with no fear. They were confident now, certain this strange herd of exhausted men could offer no challenge. Reynolds swallowed hard. They're learning us. Frank didn't answer. He didn't want to give words to something so obvious. The current shifted again, pushing their group toward a cluster of men who were barely conscious. One of them lifted his head weakly and said, "Help. Just hold me up. Please." Another man muttered nonsense while staring at the sky as if reading something on it. Frank steadied one of them before he drifted under. "Keep your chin up," he said. "You dip under, you're done." The man nodded, but his eyes were unfocused. A sharp cry snapped through the air. A survivor farther out slapped at the water wildly, screaming, "Yassi, help! Something's beneath me! Help!" He splashed in a frantic circle. The sound carried far. Frank winced. "No, don't!" But the splashing was too loud, too frantic. The sharks responded instantly, several fins angling towards him, cutting smooth lines in the water. Survivors shouted for him to stop, but panic drowned their words. The cries vanished abruptly. The sea fell quiet. Reynolds shut his eyes. "Frank, I can't keep watching this." Frank kept his gaze steady on the horizon. "Don't watch. Just float. Just breathe." Hope was thinning, fraying like old rope. A survivor near Frank whispered, "We're not going to make it, are we?" Frank didn't answer. He couldn't lie, and he couldn't speak the truth. The sun continued to climb, hammering them with unbearable brightness. Some survivors drifted into hallucinations again. One insisted he could see soldiers on the water, waving them in. Another whispered to a woman who wasn't there. A young sailor began swimming toward a shimmering mirage that looked like land. Frank shouted, "Stop! Stop! Come back!" But the sailor didn't hear him. He swam harder, convinced he saw salvation just ahead. A shadow moved beneath him. A fin followed with careful patience. Frank closed his eyes as the water ahead rippled. The ocean smoothed over again. The third morning grew harsher. Survivors leaned against floating debris as if it were the only thing holding their minds together. Frank kept scanning the horizon until his vision blurred. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, maybe no one's coming. Maybe they forgot us." Frank shook his head slowly. "Someone will notice. Someone always does." But even he didn't believe the words the way he had yesterday. A weak breeze drifted across the water, the first movement of air they'd felt since dawn. The faintest smell of oil clung to it, something metallic, something unnatural. Frank lifted his head. "Do you smell that?" Reynolds blinked. What is it?" Frank's pulse quickened. Could be wreckage from us, or something else. A murmur moved through the group. The men on the raft stirred. Some survivors lifted their heads with sudden, quiet hope. The breeze shifted again, carrying the scent a little stronger now. It wasn't salvation, but it was something different, something that didn't belong solely to the Pacific. Frank gripped the crate tighter. Stay awake, stay calm. Something's changing. The third morning wasn't mercy. It wasn't rescue. But it was the first sign the ocean wasn't the only thing out there anymore. The third afternoon stretched on in a haze of heat and delirium. But somewhere beneath the exhaustion, something subtle changed. Frank couldn't define it at first. Just a strange, thin tension in the air, like the ocean was holding its breath. The water rocked them in slow, uneasy swells, the kind that felt less natural and more like distant movement from something large. Reynolds clung to the crate with half-lidded eyes. "Frank, the smell's still there." Frank nodded. The faint scent of oil drifted across the water again. Metallic, heavy, nothing like the scent of the open Pacific. It came in thin waves, carried by the shifting breeze. It wasn't strong enough to reveal a source, but it wasn't fading either. "That's not us," Frank murmured. "It's something else. Something close enough for the wind to catch." Reynolds blinked in slow confusion. "A ship?" Frank didn't answer. A breeze could carry scent a long way, or only a short one. Hope was dangerous. But ignoring the possibility was its own kind of death. The sharks circled nearby, closer now, their movements bolder as the day's heat peaked. A fin slid past within 10 feet, slicing the surface with smooth precision. The survivors tightened instinctively, legs raised, arms gripping debris. But even the sharks behaved differently. Less like hunters, more like they were reacting to the same invisible shift in the water. A distant metallic groan echoed, low and faint, as if something heavy shifted miles away. Reynolds' eyes snapped open. "Frank, there, hear that?" Frank held still. The survivors around him lifted their heads weakly, listening. Another groan. Longer this time, almost like machinery straining under pressure. A man on the raft whispered hoarsely, "Engines!" But no engines followed. Just silence, just heat, just the ocean rolling in slow, uneasy breaths. Some survivors slumped, the moment of hope exhausting them more than the sun. Frank kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning the faint haze. Movement flickered, so faint he questioned whether he imagined it. A tiny speck dipping in and out of the glare. No shape, no colour, just interruption. Frank narrowed his eyes. "Reynolds, look there." Reynolds forced his head up. I see something. Do you?" "I'm not sure." It vanished, then reappeared. then vanished again. A hallucination? Absolutely possible. The mirages today had been cruel. But something about the pattern, the way the speck broke the light, felt wrong for a trick of heat. Before he could say more, a survivor just a few yards off suddenly jerked upright. "Hey, hey, is that—" He splashed once too hard, and the sharks immediately turned. Frank hissed, "Stop moving!" But it was too late. The fins angled in, sharp and immediate. Two men grabbed him, pulling him back into the circle, holding him still as his panic reached its peak. The sharks passed by, circling once, twice, then drifting back into deeper water. Frank let out a slow breath. Stay calm. Every sound, every motion, they notice. But the bigger fear wasn't the sharks. It was the possibility that hope had just been a shared illusion. The sun dipped slightly, softening its glare. Shadows stretched across the water as the sky shifted toward gold. And then Frank heard it. A faint, pulsing thump carried through the water more than the air. Not engines, not thunder, not the ocean. Something mechanical, rhythmic. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, that's not in my head. Tell me it's not in my head." Frank swallowed. "No, I hear it." The survivors around them stirred, too weak to shout, but not too weak to hope. Heads lifted, eyes widened. A murmur rolled across the scattered groups. "What is that?" "Engines." No, it's too faint. Could be could be wreck." The noise faded again. The breeze shifted, taking it with the scent of oil. For a moment, everything went still, eerily still. The sharks sank deeper, their shapes vanishing from sight. Frank felt every nerve sharpen. The quiet wasn't natural. Not after 2 days of circling predators. Something in the deep had changed the ocean's rhythm. Reynolds whispered, "What does that mean?" Frank kept staring toward the flickering speck. "It means something's out there. I don't know what, but something." The third afternoon waned, and for the first time since the Indianapolis sank, the ocean didn't feel endless. It felt like it had company. Evening crept in slowly, the sun sinking into a muted gold haze that made the entire Pacific glow as if lit from below. The heat softened, replaced by a gentler warmth that should have felt comforting. Yet every man still floating in the water could sense the shift beneath it. The ocean had changed rhythm. The sharks had sunk deeper, and that faint thumping sound, whatever it was, still echoed now and then like a heartbeat, muffled by miles of water. Frank kept one hand hooked into the crate, the other steadying Reynolds. "Stay awake," he murmured. "This is when people fade." Reynolds blinked hard, fighting sleep. "Frank, I still see it. The shape on the horizon." Frank looked again. The speck was clearer now. Not constant, not defined, but reappearing every time the swell lifted them high enough. It moved differently than a mirage. It wasn't shimmering. It wasn't bending in the light. It was too solid, too steady. "You see that?" Frank whispered to the group. A man on the raft lifted his head. "Yeah, I think so. Another whispered, "It's real. It has to be. It—" A shark fin surfaced suddenly, slicing the water just behind the raft. Everyone fell silent. Even the air seemed to pause. The fin arced smoothly, unhurried, before dipping under again. But its path was different now. Wider circles, slower movements, as if distracted by something else. "That's new," Frank murmured. "They're acting different." "Because they hear it too," Reynolds said. "Whatever's out there." The thumping returned. Not loud, just a faint pulse carried beneath the water. This time it lasted longer. Some survivors straightened. Others looked around as if emerging from deep sleep. A man a few feet away whispered, "Engines. Those are engines. They have to be." But the sound faded again, faded into a hollow quiet that pressed against their ears like pressure. The ocean rolled once, twice, then settled into a strange stillness. Frank felt the hairs on his arms rise. "Something's moving the water." Reynolds lifted his head. "Like what?" Frank didn't answer. He stared into the deep, waiting for another sign. The water around them thickened with tension. It felt alive, not with sharks this time, but with anticipation. A survivor farther back said, "I see something else. Look, over there." His voice cracked from dehydration, but the urgency in it jolted the nearby men. Frank followed the direction he pointed. Another flicker appeared, larger than before, rising just above the horizon before sinking behind a swell. For a moment, he thought it might be the sun reflecting off metal. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, is it a ship?" "I don't know," Frank said. But he felt something inside him tilt, something like hope. Not enough to stand on, but enough to breathe differently. The sharks resurfaced again, but only briefly. They circled once, then spiraled downward. Their retreat made the survivors shiver more than their presence had. "They're leaving," a man murmured. "Why are they leaving?" Frank's heart pounded. Sharks didn't abandon such an easy field unless something larger disrupted the water. Something loud, big, foreign. The breeze carried the scent of oil again, stronger now, sharp enough to cut through salt. Survivors lifted their heads in ragged unison. A man near the raft whispered, "I know that smell. That's not drift. That's fuel in the air." Reynolds's voice was shaky with disbelief. "Frank, someone's close. Someone's actually close." Frank tightened his grip on the crate. "Don't shout yet. Save your strength." Another pulse echoed through the water, deeper, closer, unmistakably mechanical. Even the ocean's surface quivered for a moment. Some survivors began quietly crying. Not loud, not frantic. Just soft, exhausted tears that came from a place beyond fear. Frank's chest tightened. Not from dread this time, but from a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to entertain since the ship went down. The sun slid lower, brushing the sky with orange and red. The speck on the horizon glinted once more, longer now, catching the dying light in a way no wave ever did. Reynolds grabbed Frank's arm. "It's moving. Frank, look, it's moving. Frank watched. The speck shifted left, then right, following a deliberate path. Ships moved like that. Only ships moved like that. His throat tightened. Everyone stay together. If it's real, if it's coming this direction, we need to be visible. A few survivors lifted weak arms, barely able to wave. Others whispered prayers so hoarse they were nearly silent. Frank kept his eyes locked on the horizon. The ocean wasn't empty anymore. Something was out there. Something big. Something searching. And for the first time in 3 nights, hope didn't feel like a hallucination. It felt like a shadow moving steadily toward them. Night didn't arrive sharply. It leaked slowly into the sky, dimming the gold of the setting sun until the horizon was a deep, bruised purple. Frank's eyes strained every time the swell lifted him high enough to glimpse the distant glint. The shape on the horizon rose and fell with the waves, sometimes vanishing entirely, sometimes shining like a shard of metal in the fading light. Reynolds clung weakly to the crate. "Frank, is it still there?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, it's there." Even saying that felt dangerous. Hope was fragile out here. Too loud, and it shattered. Too soft, and it slipped away. Another faint mechanical thrum rolled beneath the water, the strongest one yet. It vibrated through their ribs like a heartbeat. Men around them stirred, eyes widening. Some whispered. Some cried quietly without lifting their heads. The sharks stayed deep now, shadows fading into darker shadows below. They weren't circling anymore. They weren't testing the edges. They'd vanished with the growing noise, as if they understood the hierarchy of the ocean and were yielding space to something larger. A survivor on the raft rasped, It's a ship. I swear to God, I see the bow." Another man whispered, "Don't say that unless you're sure. Please." Frank forced himself upright against the crate. His vision blurred from exhaustion, but he could make out the faint shape, long, low, steady, cutting slowly across the horizon. A searchlight snapped on. It carved a brilliant beam across the darkening sky, sweeping the ocean in a slow arc. The survivors gasped as one. Some screamed weakly. Some simply collapsed from the surge of emotion. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, they're looking for us." Frank swallowed hard. "They are." The beams swept past their section of the ocean, illuminating whitecaps, bodies, bits of wreckage. It missed them the first time, missed again the second time. Each sweep brought a new ripple of tension, hope rising and falling like the swells underneath them. "Wave," Frank said. "Whatever strength you've got left." His arm felt like sandbags, but he lifted it. The men around him followed, slow, trembling movements, barely above the water. The beam swept left, closer, closer. Then it overshot again, vanishing into the dark. Reynolds whimpered, "Please, please come back." Frank held his breath as the light began another pass, moving deliberately this time. Slower, more methodical. It scanned a tight grid across the sea, closer than before. A murmur spread through the survivors. They see something. They're slowing. God, don't let them turn away. The engine thrum deepened, louder now, unmistakable. The ship was turning. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, they're coming right at us." The searchlight halted, fixed on a point just behind them. Then it swept a few degrees forward and hit their group dead on. Light exploded across the water. Hundreds of men came into view like ghosts materializing out of the sea. The beam lingered, then narrowed, confirming what it had found. Shouts echoed from the distant ship. Sharp commands, urgent voices, men running across decks. The survivors couldn't hear the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were seen. They were real. They were alive. Frank let out a long breath, his whole body shaking with relief he'd refused to feel until this moment. Reynolds broke into a weak sob against the crate. Flare guns fired into the sky, 2, then 3, casting red light across the waves. The ship slowed, engines rumbling low as spotlights multiplied, scanning wider and brighter. A smaller craft splashed into the water, a rescue boat lowering fast, men shouting as they sped toward the survivors. The ocean, so still and cruel moments ago, erupted with purposeful motion. Searchlights, engines, flares, oars cutting through water. Men who were silent for hours now tried to call out, their voices cracking from dehydration. Reynolds whispered, "Frank, we made it." Frank rested his head against the crate. We held on long enough. The rescue boat reached the closest cluster of survivors, pulling men aboard with practiced urgency. Others floated limp, barely conscious, eyes unfocused as rescuers wrapped arms around them. A medic leaned over the edge, shouting, "Keep your heads up! We're here! We're here now!" Frank felt hands grab him and Reynolds, lifting, pulling, steadying. The weight of being held, being saved, was almost too much for his body to process. His vision dimmed with the shock of relief. Reynolds rested against the boat's edge, tears mixing with salt water. I thought we were dead. Frank managed a faint smile. So did the ocean. The sharks remained deep. The night air cooled. The ship's floodlights turned the sea into a bright, glimmering field. And for the first time since the Indianapolis sank, the darkness wasn't closing in. It was lifting.